So I am very happy to have with me today our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine of Real Progressives. Steve is host of the Macro and Cheese podcast, a podcast on economic and political issues from an MMT lens. Make sure that you're not missing that podcast if you don't check it out already. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on, buddy.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about a popular news story right now, and in many ways there are newsworthy elements of this story about what's going on in Afghanistan. There's this particular narrative out there that the United States has spent $300 million per day on this war, and that is driving the nation broke, and this kind of disingenuous narrative. Can you explain a little bit what that actually means and why spending that money as we did is actually problematic in a real resource sense, as opposed to how that narrative has played out in the mainstream press?
Well, sure. So, Luke, actually, the way our country operates, unfortunately, is that we've become enamored, if you will, of military spending over the last 50, 60, 70 years, because it's a way of getting money into the economy without having to explain socialism or any other things that get them bogged down ideologically. And so, support the troops, be patriotic. These colors don't run. All these tropes, salute the flag. It all plays into spending on the military. And when it comes to making a booming economy, you need the federal government to constantly be spending into the economy, especially an economy like ours, which is largely a net importer. I mean, I believe our net importing status is somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 billion per year in terms of the difference between what we bring in and what we send out. So minimally, the federal government would look to put at least that back into the thing to avoid, a money famine, as my friend Steve Larchuk says. So I think it's important to kind of understand, first of all, that the reason why we spend so much on the military isn't just to be the world police. It is largely the only way that people bipartisanly are willing to spend money into the system. And that money makes it first to Halliburton, it makes it first to Lockheed Martin, it makes it to Boeing, it makes it to all these different groups out there. And then it is spent on troops, it's spent on airplanes, it's spent on a host of different things. And each of those airplanes are built with piece parts from around the country. Each of those buttons on that soldier's uniform are built in different parts of the country. And so ultimately, the way we spend on the military is a way of getting money into the economy to get it into the system and so forth. And so what I think you see here is at 300 million a day to equip the army to stay out there in Iraq or in Afghanistan or whatever. This is serving multiple geopolitical concerns, but it is also the main spigot into the economy to pour money without rebuttal. You saw Trump was able to go world famous with making, I think it was 750 billion on the military budget, and Joe Biden said, "Hold my beer," and it made it even bigger. And that's because they understand that nobody's going to really push back on spending on the military. And so usually we focus on empire, we focus on, wars across the globe. But if you look, many of the planes and different things that we build, they never make it to theater. They're sitting there unused because we're not at war. We're not doing these things. And so, again, you spend money on these things we don't necessarily need, but that money becomes someone else's income, and then it becomes their spending and so forth. And that's how the whole trickle-down argument operates. So in terms of, the actions in Afghanistan, I think it's important to note that as we pull out of Afghanistan, et cetera, that 300 million, is monies that we're not going to be spending anymore in that realm, even though we asked for even more in the military budget. So something's going on there, right? Something is not quite making sense unless you realize that ultimately this is really about how do they get money into the economy without pushback. So I don't know
And
if
of
I
course, in
answered your
our
question.
you absolutely did. And unfortunately, in our corrupt society, a lot of that money ends up in the shareholders and investors of Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman and all these other military contractors. But that's a political problem, not so much an economic one, which is what you're speaking about.
Yes.
And I would actually note even Wolf Blitzer, who I think is absolutely awful, when someone pushed back on the Forever Wars. I'll never forget this clip. Wolf looks right into the camera and says, "What about the jobs? Like we need to bomb black and brown people around the world because of jobs, right?" Well, we happen to have an answer for that, and perhaps you can explain briefly what our response to that line of narrative would be.
Sure. I mean, even if we maintained a standing army, even if we like really heavily invested in the military, there's nothing that prevents the military, especially those soldiers, from doing things domestically, not war, but doing actual work, doing actual um, efforts, if you will, to rebuilding infrastructure, Army Corps of Engineers, on and on and on. There's so much that we could do with that disciplined crew as opposed to killing people. It's not
Mm-hmm.
funny. But what if we said maybe the military isn't the right way of getting employment? Maybe that's not the best use of those tools. Well, you look at the infrastructure in this country, it's falling apart. So by having a robust infrastructure bill, we could hire lots and lots and lots of blue collar workers to fill the void that's made by pulling out of Iraq. But let's just say that you're looking at it and you're saying, well, not everybody's going to get filled by that. And you're right. So, what about a federal job guarantee? And that federal job guarantee is a federally funded, locally administered, voluntary right to a job. And it's socially productive work as opposed to working for the man. It's not intended to compete with capital. It's not intended to compete with, private sector markets. It's intended to be social spending for the social good for the public purpose in the local community. And so if imagine, people coming out of high school, uh, maybe leaving college, trying to find a job while they're in college, whatever, a federal job guarantee would pay them a living wage, give them benefits, et cetera. So those low end wage earners wouldn't have to go into the military. There would be an opportunity here through the job guarantee. So there's a lot of ways of mitigating that lack of spending. But I want to be crystal clear. We don't need to cut spending. The problem is that because we couldn't get social programs paid for, they in turn spent even more money on the military to keep our economy from falling apart. It had nothing to do, shouldn't say nothing to do, but largely it was about getting money into the economy. And they
Yeah.
use this as a backdoor way. But there was an incredibly important documentary that I wanted to touch on going back to the manufacturing of planes and things like that. John McCain, ironically, was in this, and it was called Why We Fight. And what you found was this systematic way of building an airplane. They purposely build the knobs in Massachusetts and the seat lever in Wisconsin and the seat cushion in Florida and uh, the digital displays in Washington State, and
You keep
each
everyone
one of
on
these
board that
things
way, right?
keep everyone on board. Everyone's getting a taste of the military pie. And you know what? Those states are desperate for that funding, because without it, they're really in trouble because they don't have enough money because the federal government doesn't spend on social spending. It really doesn't. The federal government largely tries to stay deficit neutral, which means it drives up the taxes to offset any spending, which is a zero sum gain. And it's like a household budget narrative.
Right.
When in reality, I mean, why the heck wouldn't they just go ahead and spend it and then tax away whatever they need to tax away to stave off, really very limited inflation? And
Yeah.
these are questions that I think we need to understand, because or situations we need to understand, because people always ask why is this happening? And you can tell that if they went ahead and said, yes, kill the F-35 fighter plane, kill it, kill that project dead. Well, all those piece parts that have been farmed out across the country and in some cases around the world, those people are going to be like, hey, where's my money? Where's my cash cow? That cash cow is how money gets into that local grocer, sadly. That's their methodology for it. So you pull the plug on building the F-35, you pull the plug on these different things. And unless you're offsetting that by new spending, and cutting spending here does not constitute having money left over. When you stop spending here, it requires a new bill for something else to have new spending. Cutting spending, raising taxes does nothing to actually putting money into the economy. I think it's really, really important. I think most people miss this.
It's quite a cynical gun that they kind of have held to the head of voters that hey, if you oppose this strongly enough, then you're basically going to cripple your own community. And you know, that's to tell a very brief personal story. I'm back in school now, but I was expelled from high school the day after I was expelled from, for weed. Nothing. I was for weed. But anyhow, the point is, the next day, I kid you not, the very next day, I got an email. I was 17 years old. I got an email from an Army recruiter.
Oh my God.
And I gave that recruiter a piece of my mind. Like, how dare you prey on me and other, economically, people in tough economic situations who've just lost their opportunity at an education. So to your point, the military being the employer of last resort and the only option for people who might have no other way to fund their education, that would go away if we had a federal job guarantee, and you would not be forced into this particular scenario. You tweeted earlier, kind of talking broadly about something you just mentioned. And before we get into the race to the bottom, I was just hoping you could comment on this. You talked about decoupling these two ideas, decoupling the taxation policy from the spending policy. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what MMT teaches us about this and why these should be separate discussions as opposed to connected?
Sure. Yeah. The purpose for taxation is not to fund programs at the federal level. The purpose of this is to drive currency, to put a necessary obligation to maintain the strength and viability of the dollar. It's not based on petrodollar. It's not based on, military Keynesianism or anything like that. It's based on the ability to produce real goods and services. And it's based on the idea that our tax is payable only in the said currency. So if you think about what the purpose of taxes are, they're to basically control certain types of behaviors, to regulate them out of existence, Pigovian type taxes. It's also to kind of level set the pricing structure as a numeraire. And if you don't know what a numeraire is, it's kind of like a reference point. It doesn't mean that this spending or whatever is actually paying for this. It's like kind of like a check mark on a spreadsheet. Yeah. Okay. It's denominated in that. It's kind of like this is the unit of account, but it's not it's not used to spend. So they might do this on a spreadsheet, like what you see with Social Security. When you get that document back that says I paid 32,000 into Social Security over my lifetime, or 100,000 or whatever. And you're like, hey, I paid into Social Security. Well, no, it really is just, you got a statement of how much you paid, and that's it. It tells you how much you made annually, and it tells you how much you paid into the system. It doesn't actually fund Social Security. So if you think about it like that, decoupling taxation from spending makes all the sense in the world. I mean, we're no longer tied to credit markets. We're no longer tied to any of that. So the tax can be useful in solving for inequality. It can be useful to drive certain behaviors and to maybe stop certain behaviors, like speculative behavior on the Wall Street markets. It might be used to stop smoking. Let's say that it's starting to really cause our healthcare system to collapse even worse than it is now. And so they want to go ahead and tax cigarettes higher. It's not necessary to raise money per se, because anything that you tax to raise money for, you got to keep that in place. Otherwise, your funding source dries up. So if you're raising taxes on cigarettes, naturally, that means you want cigarettes to stay around so you can pay for them, right? Wrong. They're doing it to get rid of cigarettes so that you don't smoke. So that's the Pigovian side of it. None of this is a funding operation for any programs. So the real question is, what do we care about? What do we want to fund? If we can fund it, if we can create it, and we can buy it with US dollars, it's affordable. We can do it, period. Because we create dollars out of thin air when we spend, and we delete them when we tax. So if you're only going to delete the tax, and the purpose of the tax is to stave off inflation or to drive behaviors, well, then make yourself a separate tax policy that has nothing to do with the spending policy, and stop saying you're funding it with taxes, because you're not funding with taxes. Start talking about real. Say we foresee that we're going to need to have certain automatic stabilizing taxes kicked in should certain events happen. Certain events. So we bake them in with automatic stabilizers. We have automatic stabilizers for spending. There's no reason we can't have automatic stabilizers for taxation as well. If we hit certain, things in the economy, inflation isn't just rising slightly, it's like spiraling up, escalating constantly month after month after month. 1 month it's 4%, next month 5%, next month 6%, 7, 8, 9. That right there is escalating, inflation. But average inflation, 2-3%, that's normal, and we need that, because otherwise people that are in debt would never be able to get out of debt ever. They would always be in chronic debt. So, and it would also put the havers, the people that have money, always in the catbird seat, whereas the people that don't have would always be in a horrible situation. So decoupling taxation, creating a tax plan that works based on the purpose it's derived for, and having spending specific to working on whatever subject you're trying to achieve, you can have an honest debate about the spending that way. That it's not going to bankrupt us. That it's not about taxes. So let's talk about what our nation's priorities are. Is it a moral hazard? Whatever, but
I like the way I've heard it put is that budgets are priorities. You just have to look at it that way. That when Congress puts a budget out there, it's saying what is important, how it's prioritizing things, etc. And I would also add to what you're saying. I think taxes can be used to create a more equitable society. When we have a wealth gap like this, I think you could put in some sort of, not in the political environment we currently have, we're talking theoretically, but you could put in some sort of automatic tax. When the wealth gap hits X, we implement X tax on billionaires or whatever it might be. So I completely and totally agree with that. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the race to the bottom today. I have a map here on realprogressives.org. If you haven't checked out our website, make sure to do so. We have all sorts of articles and fantastic content there for you. And our Patreon is there too, if you'd like to support our organization. One new portion of our website is the race to the bottom, and this map is shown there. Steve, I'm hoping you can just kind of briefly explain what the race to the bottom is, and then we can go into some of the specifics of this map and what the numbers mean.
Sure. Yeah. So the race to the bottom is an unfortunate thing that happens in a country set up the way ours is. States are all competing with one another for business. They're competing for people to live there. They're competing for jobs. They're competing for a host of things. And what ends up happening is that, businesses are always looking for the most sweetheart deal they can get tax-wise to set up their headquarters or move their, operations plant or whatever into the, into another state, and they use this as kind of like bribery to get the other state to drop the bottom out of their tax base for them, to give them sweetheart deals and perks and so forth. And they always promise, hey, we'll bring in 100,000 jobs to the state, or we'll bring in 50,000, or we'll bring in 10,000, or whatever. And so the state says, oh, an untold wealth is going to come in because your business is going to come here, or they'll give us this tax base and so forth. Well, when Texas says, hey, we don't have any sales tax, or we don't have any income tax, or we don't have, whatever, or hey, we're going to do it this way, and you guys we'll give you money to come down here to Texas, and people like Rick Perry and and many Texas governors have often bragged about their strategy of luring people down there to Texas. Well, you look and you can see how that migration occurs, how the Flint, Michigans of the world become Flint, Michigan when the industry leaves, when Detroit starts moving its auto processing down to Mexico or some other state. You look at Sam Brownback in Kansas, and you realize that they dropped the bottom of the tax rate for businesses with the hope that they would lure them in there. And lo and behold, they were so cash strapped that schools couldn't even open. They were using
Yep.
books that were like 10 years old and falling apart. I mean, it was awful. So the race to the bottom is really about the states devouring each other in pursuit of business, and lowering the taxes, and then invariably the fracking companies come in and they offer sweetheart deals for fracking, and the states starve for cash, so they offer it to them with the idea of taxing fracking fracking monies to fund state programs. So now you're funding yourself through the destruction of the environment.
Right.
And so there's so much more to this. But ultimately, because the federal government is the currency issuer and states are currency users, they're highly dependent on taxes, they're highly dependent on investments, and they're highly dependent on the federal government springing funding on them in different ways. And when you take away the tax base and business leaves, and now you take away the commerce, and the jobs are gone, your tax base, zip code by zip code, which pays the schools, dries
Right.
up and they fall apart. And so what we talk about, the race to the bottom, is this competition that drives things down, 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 until the people are left without a boat to get out. They have no way of getting out, and they're trapped. And then those businesses leave. And that's the typical Rust Belt story that you see throughout the United States. Buffalo, former Pittsburgh, many places. I mean, you see counties, states, municipalities going broke. They have
Yeah.
unfunded mandates. They have pension plans that are blowing up, that are like unfunded or underfunded. A whole
Yeah.
bunch of things are put on the states. And so what do the states do? They cut spending, because that's their only recourse. They either
Yeah.
raise taxes, which then prompts the others to leave,
Yeah.
or they cut spending. And this is the catch-22 the states find themselves in. So this map here, it's not finished. This is nowhere near done. But the idea is to look at what they call the CAFR reports, or the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports. And these are a fiscal position of every state in the country. And they have to report these to Congress. And so you can find the CAFR reports out there, and you can find them by your state. And so what we're doing with this is we're trying to demonstrate not only the fiscal position of each state, and show how very little wiggle room each of them have, and show that some of the states like California and others are significantly in better shape. So
Sure. Yeah.
once you learn how that race to the bottom works, then you start being able to determine a little bit better how states are, because they can't create currency. So they either got to lure business in to get that tax revenue back up, or they end up cutting. And that's what the race to the bottom is really all about.
And I would add to that, you've described what the dynamics are. Imagine how severely vulnerable and susceptible this dynamic leaves these programs to a recession or to an economic crash, right? Then the state is in a place where its ability, which is already restricted to fund these programs, is even more severely restricted. There are a whole bunch of potentials for problems when you fund your programs through this through a state-based plan. So I'm going to start with your state here, Steve. You guys can see up on the screen here. I'm sorry, that's Ohio. Here's Pennsylvania. Oh, it's there. New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Homeless population of 13,199. Your pensions are funded 54.8%, and your rainy day fund is 3.6 days. Can you just kind of briefly explain what those numbers mean and what they indicate for Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so the government can run for 3.6 days without any income coming in. It's got enough to last for 3.6 days. The other issue is the pensions. They're 54% funded. In other words, people who have believed their entire lives that their pension would be there may not be there. And they're underfunded. They should be picked up by the federal government immediately across the nation, but they're not. And so my state is always in precarity. I mean, if you look, in Pennsylvania, we have what is called the Marcellus Shale. And the Marcellus Shale is the group that does fracking, and they do road improvements and everything else. And there even some talk about funding schools with the revenues from the fracking dollars.
Oh
So
my
this
God.
is the way they're trying to make up for that delta. The other alternative is, because we are largely a purple state, so a lot of Republicans here, you're going to see a lot of public-private partnerships, a la neoliberal framing.
Right.
You're also going to see a lot of push to reduce spending, cut spending, make people get back to work, forget the pandemic, rush back to the office, rush back to school. And that whole thinking comes from the race to the bottom, because they want to get commerce back going. And ultimately, that's what those numbers mean.
Well, and let's take a look then at a state that is outwardly in better shape, which is my state, Washington. We have a higher homeless population, though, 21,577 homeless in Washington state, 94% roughly pensions funded, and a rainy day fund of 25 and a half days. I just want to note here that some of the dynamics you just talked about, where fracking is the industry of fracking would be empowered sort of politically by funding these programs. Washington state you may think of us as a progressive state, and relatively, I suppose we are, but Boeing is a horrible polluter. They've participated in the military industrial complex, which we started this conversation off talking about. Do you want to empower them in this way? Starbucks utilizes slave labor overseas for beans. Do you want to empower that company in this way? Microsoft, Amazon, we talk all the time about how brutal Amazon is to their workers. Do you want to empower this company in these ways? So I was hoping you could comment on, even in the states where some of these state programs may appear more viable, what are some of the political downsides to engaging in state-based programs in a state, even where it appears outwardly that state can afford, quote unquote, to do that, or can more easily implement that program?
Well, whatever you tax, you legitimize. Okay. And so if you're expecting to tax billionaires, you're legitimizing billionaires, because that means you need those billionaires to fund your programs. Okay. So you're naturally not going to attack wealth, because you need their wealth to be able to fund the programs. Your businesses that are bad actors, that are like those folks fueling the military industrial complex, your state is highly dependent on the revenues coming from Boeing, from Starbucks and their slave labor with the beans, and all the other scenarios you painted. The minute you tax them, you legitimize that. And that means that you have to depend on them to keep your revenues up. So what are you going to do if you depend on them for your revenues? Once you start raising taxes on them, okay, they have options, because there's Texas down there going, come on down to Texas. We got a home for you there, brother. And Texas, they say, you see that meme where you got the hot girl walking like this, and the guy sitting there turning back like
turning
this,
around,
and
yeah, he's rubbernecking.
Right. That's the Texas scenario, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you got Boeing going, oh, check out Texas. And then you've got Seattle and all of them going, oh, how dare you look at Texas, right? That's
Boeing
kind of
already
the deal.
moved one of their major plants to North Carolina. They already did it just a few years ago.
Exactly. And this will continue to happen, as we've got a huge amount of history that you don't even need to speculate from. You can just crack a book, click a link, and not clickbait, click a link about the race to the bottom, find out, there's a lot of fraud that goes on also. There's a lot of payola. There's a lot of things that make each state really, really suspect when you give them specific cash without encumbering it from the federal government. And encumbering, what I mean by encumbering, is you're putting stipulations on that money. It must do X, it must do Y, it must do Z. And like when you're in the federal government, they have certain rules on procurement. You have to do what they call the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Requirements, or whatever. And basically it says you got to have at least 3 bidders to pick a thing. You can't just go to someone as a sole source and just pick them, right? You have to actually bid the stuff out. And when you think of it like that, I think it's kind of important to think about what it's like at the state level, right? I mean, the state is got similar type requirements on it as well. And everything about the state is completely dependent, sadly, on that federal spending. So, the race to the bottom, this whole dynamic here, especially in somewhere like Washington State that looks really good, you say, well, you progressives out there, you are legitimizing Boeing. You're legitimizing Amazon. You're legitimizing Microsoft or whatever. Everything that you tax, you legitimize. Okay. And now you're dependent on. So, obviously our goal here is to get the federal government to get in the business of spending directly. And if when they spend on the states, to encumber that. Block grants to the states are fine, but how much of that money actually makes it to the people? And so it's important to stipulate that in your bill. It's important to put some parameters around that. This money is intended for these 5 things: to rebuild schools, to rebuild roads, to fix all your bridges, to whatever.
Right.
And if they don't do that, then there should be some serious penalties. And so what ends up happening is that because the federal government is not doing that, a lot of these well-meaning groups are trying to find a way to fund their programs and fund their ideas by taxing the rich. And again, it sounds good, eat the rich, until the rich pick up and leave and go to Texas. So I think this is just one of those natural things you talk about in Marxist theory. You talk about capital flight. Well, you also have suburban flight. You also have white flight from the cities where they leave, and all of a sudden they leave those cities without a tax base,
Right.
And this is not me saying this like, oh, what a bad guy I am. This is me saying this is how it is.
Yeah.
That's how it is. It's empirical.
Take it or
This is
leave
how
it.
it is.
Yeah.
I'm not, don't hate the player, hate the game. This is the game. So
no, we are not sitting here endorsing this horrendous system at all. In fact, we're sitting here criticizing it and saying you should fund this stuff at the federal level where you can afford to do so.
Yes.
The last thing about this I really wanted to get your thoughts on, Steve. There seems to be a whole nother angle to this, and I'll take it really big picture and use a really extreme example, which is the Civil War. We fought that war over a state's right to infringe on the rights of the Black community. At some point, every person agrees that we should not let states infringe on people's rights to that degree. States should not have the power to do that. When it comes to something, to use a smaller picture example like Obamacare, where states were left in charge of to what extent are they going to fund certain aspects of this program, you end up in a position where 20-some, 30-some states grossly neglect their constituents, really all of them, but you get the point that I'm saying in relative to other states. You get a number of states which choose to neglect their citizens. So when you leave this much power in charge of the states, how do you end up sort of making up for that if you're not going to engage in federal spending in terms of how those states are going to treat the poor and impoverished and marginalized communities in their among their residents?
Well, I think you saw the 14th Amendment used to justify the ACA individual mandate, and you saw it used with the Commerce Clause. But you also realize that part of this is about, in making all things equal protection under the law kind of thing. And so with that in mind, by not focusing on how they make things unequal, I should say, you miss the big picture. So I think part of this is federalizing everything has created a very, very bad scenario for the most vulnerable. I think that ultimately the federal government has to step in, but if it won't step in financial or fiscally with money, it should at least step in by eliminating the unfunded mandates and things like that they impose upon states, that states then in turn have to make up that money for somehow to pay for that federal law that was never funded at the federal level. And I think that some of this could be mitigated by eliminating all unfunded mandates. But there is no way of really controlling the state unless when you give them that money, you encumber it and you say it must do this, that, and the other. And You saw the states reject Medicaid expansion. You saw the states reject a bunch of opportunities, like even prolonging, giving unemployment benefits to people, federal monies for that. They reject it. Why? Because they want to get people back to work. Why? Because their donors are begging them to get them back to work. And so ultimately, again, there's no real way of controlling that short of encumbering those dollars or regulation. And our government doesn't appear to be overly interested in regulation, not good regulation, and they certainly are not interested in trying to force the states to do things, because we still have no right to an education in this country.
Yeah.
We still don't have it. It's all still state-based, and it's all paid for by the local zip code.
Yeah.
That should easily be taken over by the federal government, but such a horrible fight would break out. This has been before the Supreme Court board, Brown versus the Board of Education, you name it. And ultimately, it turns out there is no federal right to education, and therefore the states own that, the payoff for education. And that's why you see so much inequality. That's why you see rich neighborhoods having great schools, poor neighborhoods belly up. And,
Yeah.
ultimately, I think that it really comes down to understanding how federal finance mixes with state finance, and being able to craft policy that will take in the worst parts of state-based behavior and mitigate the race to the bottom by staving off the need to tax certain groups, to tax them because they're too damn rich, but tax them at the federal level, because if you tax them at the state level, they'll just pick up and move somewhere else. And they do it all the time.
Well, I think this is a really important topic for us to keep discussing and driving home, and trying to educate people on. And lastly, Steve, can you just talk about the Macro and Cheese podcast, what you do with that podcast, where and when people can find it, and what you have coming up and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm actually a host of two important podcasts. One is Macro and Cheese, and that's on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. It's released Eastern time. And you can find it on our website, www. You go to realprogressives.org and go to our media drop down, and Macro and Cheese is under that. But I also do co-host another podcast that we release on Sunday nights called The New Untouchables, and it's very important. It shows that elite control, fraud, corruption, you name it, is very much driving our financial system in this country, including propping up property values because states are tax strapped. And so you got these inflated property values for taxes, you name it. And so the New Untouchables really draws that stuff out, and it shows how you and I and everybody else are not safe if we own a home. It shows that the powers that be are willing to turn a blind eye while elite control fraud happens in these companies, and Wall Street, and the revolving door between Wall Street and our government continues, and the laws and stuff are written by Wall Street. And so when you look at the stealing of homes, and the rocket docket, and the robo signings, and all the rest that go into foreclosures and so forth, the New Untouchables is where you're going to find all that information. So Sunday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern time, is the New Untouchables. Macro and Cheese is a podcast released Saturday mornings, 8 a.m. And it's all about modern monetary theory and subject matters that tie closely to it, from union organizing to understanding the Green New Deal, and a great many other things that should be very important to all progressives.
Fantastic work. I want to encourage everybody to check it out if you're not already watching these shows. And this is going to drop Sunday, so make sure that the New Untouchables is dropping tonight if you're watching this live. Make sure that you don't miss that on
Sunday. Oh yeah, duh.
Yeah. This is a pre-recording. Yeah. So make sure to catch that tonight. And also I've had it up on the screen here next to Steve's name. He put it there. But if you don't follow Steve on Twitter, it's at SD Grumbine. Make sure that you're following him for fantastic, tweets, as well as sharing of content and things like this. So Steve, thank you so much for taking the time, and look forward to doing this again.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it, man.